So, the first noble truth tells us life is suffering. The second noble truth tells us how it all is produced. The third noble truth tells us how it shall cease. But now we need a prescription for this disease. We need specific doctor instructions on how to achieve nirvana, this extinction of craving and attachment which produces the suffering which characterizes our existence and makes us continue to revolve on this never-ending vicious cycle of birth, life, sickness, old age, and death, and all over again. That's the fourth noble truth. It is called the Eightfold Path, or Magga. But really, it's the middle way. Why is it called the middle way? Because the idea is you avoid all extremes, because every extreme is something that either rejects or accepts something. And you, by accepting or rejecting, by loving and attaching yourself or hating and detaching and clinging, both cases produce rather than destroy the cycle. So thus, the idea is this. Remember, once we understand the first three noble truths, we understand that everything is dependent on conditions, and therefore eliminate the conditions and you eliminate the thing itself. Now you notice eliminate is an action, producing is an action. And so thus the central term in Buddhism and in Hinduism is the term karma. And you need to understand that your normal way of understanding or learning about karma was wrong. Karma is not some eternal law of consequences that, okay, if you kill someone in this life, then in your next life you're going to be killed. As if there's this law given by some god that makes justice so that every bad thing has a bad effect and every good thing has a good effect. It's just rather action. The word karma in Sanskrit literally means just action. So what the thing about action, though, is actions always have effects, don't they? And so thus what we call karma, the Buddhist calls the fruit of karma, the ripples. So imagine karma as something like this. As the pebble you throw in the pond, then those results are the ripples in the pond. The ripple effect that then affects other things and produces new thoughts and new patterns, yet always a repetition of this attachment. So, just like actions produce life and produce consciousness, so actions can extinguish it. So it's not that action in and of itself is bad, it's that you have to have the right kind of action. The kind of action that will, instead of produce ripples in the pond of your mind, rather the kind of action that slips into the pond without disturbing it. So, thus, it's not that you cease acting and just sit there and try to eliminate desire. The very trying is an action. So you just produce the right kinds of actions that will lead to the right kinds of results, the kind of results that eliminate the fuel of the fire of desire and therefore allow that fire to die down and therefore extinguish not the self. There is no self again to extinguish, but rather the attachment that produces suffering. So what is this Eightfold Path? Well, it's all about the right kind of action, as we said, and action is a general term. You can talk about physical action, but also mental action. And thus you could divide the actions in the Eightfold Path to three types. The first are ethical. So it's called sila, or ethical conduct, and that's right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The way to think of it is if you think of your mind as a pond, okay? Now, that pond is aiming at, that mind that's going to eliminate suffering is aiming at a correct view of reality called nirvana. Therefore, the pond needs to be clear so that thus reality around it is reflected in the pond and accurately reflected in the pond. And that's the key here, what you're aiming at. Remember, the aim is at something is not wrong. You got to aim just in the right way so that even that aiming will go away. So, thus, if you picture your mind as a pond, it can be really muddy and therefore not reflect or capture or grasp the nature of the reality around it, or it can be very clear and calm like a mirror. That's another way you can picture your mind. The key is to produce a mind that is so calm and so clear that no aspect of reality is hidden or distorted by it, like a really good mirror. We're going to see how this kind of knowledge is very different than what we call rational knowledge. But for now, let's just think of them as both as capturing or grasping the nature of reality. So, of course, the problem is the pond is muddy, isn't it? It's muddy because you've thrown a lot of big rocks into there. And those rocks not only have rippled the pond so that it doesn't reflect, but has also hit the bottom and caused mud to spring up, and therefore caused not only distortion, but actual blocking of the ability to grasp or reflect the reality around it. So, what do you have to do? You have to let that mud calm down, don't you? You can't throw any more stones into the pond. And the way you throw stones into the pond is through your physical actions, what you say, what you actually do, and then how you make a living, how you support your life or existence. And so what you say are things that should be true. They should be things that are not producing additional desires in others or things like that. So truth, correct speech, not hateful speech, those kinds of things. Actions are the kinds of actions that should decrease desire, not reproduce them. So therefore you restrict yourself from feeding the fires by trying to satisfy them. You restrain your desires by not doing selfish action, things that feed the self. And then livelihood just are the kinds of things that by doing them, by living in this matter, you cannot do anything but bad action or bad speech. So being a drug dealer, an arms dealer, things that produce killing or destruction or those kinds of things that are based on negative or hateful desires are things that are restricted from you. Now, by doing that, you allow the mud to sink to the bottom. But of course, you're still acting, aren't you? Your pond is still rippled, and there's a lot of waves and winds. And so therefore, the next step is to what? Calm the water. And that's mental discipline. So ethical conduct then leads to mental discipline, because you then see enough to realize that your mind needs calming and that you still distort things. And that's the next three things that you see here in the Eightfold Path: right effort, right attention, and right concentration. So what does that mean? Well, effort is about the will. So you'll notice that in all of these cases, you're using one of these 5 aggregates. And that's okay. You might think, well, you're using fire to extinguish fire, but we do this all the time. A big forest fire, the best way to stop it is to burn all of the vegetation in its path. In other words, you use fire to fight fire. You don't stop action, but through action. And so, therefore, though the will and volitions and desires produce negative karma, they can also produce the calming down of desire. Your will can determine to concentrate its mind. And when it does that, it focuses its attention on the true nature of things around it. And so if you remember, we said that what happens in the way in which your mind works is you first have the stimulation of perception, of sensations and feelings. And those feelings then produce perceptions. And it's at the stage of perception that ideas and thoughts and an I arises. So the key is to be mindful of the sensations that you have in such a way that you stop those sensations from producing thoughts and ideas. And so thus you determine to direct your awareness so that it's mindful, so that it doesn't interpret, but rather just experiences. And then once it does that, it is able to start seeing things the way they are, and by doing that, controlling and focusing the thoughts. So what we see is thus a calming down of the water, a reflecting rather than picturing, as we're going to talk a little bit more. But these three are often placed under the discipline which is called dhyana, or meditation. So you have ethical conduct, and then you have meditation. And the meditation is meant to calm the water of the mind so that the mind is prepared to reflect the reality without distorting it, without interpreting it and twisting it into its own terms, its own absolute terms. So, jhana is the Sanskrit, but what happened is as Buddhism goes into China, that term is pronounced wrongly, and it becomes Chan, and thus the most popular Buddhism in China for the longest time in the dynastic periods from the Tang all the way into the Song Dynasty is Chanzong, or Chan Buddhism. Okay, and Chan and dhyana both mean sitting, but Chinese couldn't really pronounce it, so that's how it gets there. So then Chan is pronounced and goes into Japan, and in Japan, Chan is pronounced as Zen. And so Chan Buddhism is Zen Buddhism. And in all these, they're called that because they concentrate on meditation as the central way to get to enlightenment, to get to this detachment. So, thus, mental discipline is the calming down. Now, once that calming down occurs, then wisdom occurs. Wisdom isn't something you do, it's an understanding that arises from the processes of right conduct and right thinking. So once your mind is trained to have the right kinds of thoughts, not the kinds of thoughts that interpret, again, and I'll explain that a little bit more what we mean, but the kinds of thoughts that just allow reality to be, and therefore don't separate you from that reality through your rational constructs. Thus, once you have those right thoughts, the thoughts that don't try to manipulate reality, but just understand it, then you become the pond, don't you? You become that perfect reflection. And the key about a reflection is that it doesn't reject what it reflects, neither does it try to keep it. Go in front of a mirror and try this. Go in front of the mirror and sit there. Then move. Does the mirror try to keep your sitting? Obviously not. The minute you move, the sitting disappears, doesn't it? The mirror perfectly reflects because the mirror doesn't try to keep things. It allows things to go. Thus, the mirror is this perfect example, the mirrored pond, of the enlightened mind. The mind that accepts reality as it is, doesn't try to keep it into a rational or theoretical picture. We're going to talk more about that in our next segment, because this relationship between rational knowledge and direct experiencing or mirroring, that's the wisdom of the Buddha, is very important to understand. Otherwise, you cannot have right thinking. You cannot have right attention or focus or concentration. You will think you have enlightenment when in reality you just have attachment to a new set of wrong ideas. We're also then going to talk about how that then leads to a life of compassion. Like Schopenhauer argued, but we're going to see it coming through a different way in the Buddha and the Buddhist teaching.